Thank you for tuning in to Beyond Explanation Episode 3. My name is Brandon, and I am joined by the Soulless Samurai, and we are here to discuss Unidentified Episode 3 on the History Channel. And also, we're going to get into Episode 4 as well. And also make sure if you want to stay tuned to all things associated with our channel, you can check out Escape the Mind Productions on YouTube, also on Twitter, and on iTunes and SoundCloud. And you can write us at escapethemindproductions@gmail.com. Hey, Soulless, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well, B. Hello, folks.
Definitely excited to have you back and delve a little bit further into the saga of Unidentified. We are going to cover 2 episodes in tonight's show because we want to start to catch up a little bit. I believe they're in episode 6 overall. So we have, if we catch up with 2 tonight, then the next episode is going to be, I feel, pretty information heavy.
Okay.
So I think it's going to be good for us to knock out 2 because it might take us a little bit to get into the next episode. So Unidentified Episode 3. The episode starts out with Lou basically starting to give you the idea that these unidentified craft are starting to work their way to certain rally points, certain locations of interest.
We have hot spots off of the coast of San Diego.
So they briefly go through the events of the Nimitz, which we've already talked about. Essentially, if you're just joining us, there are 3 videos that were released by the Department of Defense. I don't believe that they released them willingly, if you will, but like it was through like a freedom of information sort of deal.
Declassified.
There you go. And so there were 3 different videos. One was the Nimitz video. One was the gimbal video, and one was the Go Fast video. And you can find them by that name online on YouTube if you want to check them out for yourself. The Nimitz one we've already discussed pretty in depth if you want to go back through the first 2 episodes. If you want to talk about that or listen in about that a little bit more, go back, check those out, YouTube, SoundCloud. Again, Beyond Explanation, Episode 1 and 2. It's so far something that I feel is good, but it's also nice to be able to move into some fresh information.
Yes, agreed. They discussed the USS Nimitz encounter quite a bit, so it's nice to venture into some new territory. With the 3 films, they were peppering all 3 of them into the series so far, and I didn't realize that only one of them is from the USS Nimitz encounter. The other 2 are from the East Coast, which is what they start to get into eventually. So the gimbal and Go Fast footage are from the East Coast.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a little bit more into Episode 4. So in Episode 3, they basically start to mention about potential hotspots, and they bring forward another Navy officer. His name is Sean Cahill. He served 20 years in the Navy. He was the top security officer on board the USS Princeton, and he was responsible for law and order on the ship and running counterterrorism patrols at sea. So Cahill, in total, is now the 5th witness to come forward and talk about things that they either saw on radar specifically or whether they saw it actually with their own eyes. So
yes,
Cahill,
Sean Cahill claimed that he saw a pattern of lights and they were rotating, some disappeared, and then all of them disappeared.
Yeah, exactly. So Cahill states that he was told the Nimitz had something on the radar, that he was to kind of look out on the ship's wing and see if he could see anything. He said that they actually went to the extent of even turning the entire ship at certain points to allow him different points of view, essentially. But they didn't really say what he was supposed to be looking for. They just basically told him, hey, look out here and tell me if you see anything that's odd. And when he asked, like, hey, maybe if you give me a little bit of a better idea as to what I'm actually supposed to be seeing. And so they basically came back and told him that they had strange contacts, and that's all the real information that they would give him on it.
It's got to be difficult to look for something when you don't know what you're looking for.
Exactly. So Cahill was out on the bridge wing with another officer, and they recall seeing a constellation of lights in the sky. And the constellation would start to change position, some lights from the outside moving to the inside and some from the inside moving out, but in a circular manner, kind of rotating. And as they were rotating, they would randomly disappear. And he said that he didn't know what they were, but he did not believe that they were stars. Cahill says he doesn't understand how things like this, especially since we've now had these 3 videos being released, are not something that's on the news like every single night. That's something that has the ability to move around in our atmosphere with impunity, and that we're not really doing anything to figure out what it is or to combat it in any way.
That's a valid question from one of our first lines of defense against any kind of threats.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I have talked about this on a couple of different occasions, especially when To the Stars first came out. And I asked you, I don't understand how this isn't something that's more widely discussed on mainstream news, that, hey, if nothing else, this is just odd. This group of people have come together to investigate and discuss this topic, and they're led by Tom DeLonge from Blink-182.
It really seems newsworthy.
Yeah. And that was what almost took away some credibility from it, was the fact that mainstream news wasn't willing to cover it.
Yeah, agreed. I don't have what I'd say is 100% confidence in mainstream news, but I would hope that something that big would be
more widely discussed.
Yes.
Yeah. So Cahill spoke the next day after seeing the moving constellation with Kevin Day at breakfast on the ship. They were both aboard the same ship at the time. And basically Cahill asked Day, what was going on? And at the time, the chief was sitting with them and jokingly said that they should check their email. So after they finished eating, Cahill logs in, and he actually sees a video from the Nimitz incident and kind of mentions how it was a longer, clearer version of the video that's been released to us. It's interesting because I don't understand how we had the initial incident that we discussed in last week's episode about how there was this man in black that showed up on the ship and then demanded the footage. But yet these guys are freely passing around emails with the footage inside. But then Commander Fravor and Kevin Day were saying that when he went to make the action report, it wasn't there. So which was it? Did they have these numerous videos that everybody's passing around to each other? Or did they have them and then they disappeared? Because now I feel like you're contradicting yourself.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And you're bringing forth more eyewitness accounts, but the evidence is getting sketchier.
And I have to say that Sean Cahill had a lovely man bun.
Indeed, he did.
Cahill says that the next morning, or after the next day, they had an intelligence briefing. And he was kind of hopeful that during the briefing they might discuss the event and what happened, in hopes that they might actually shed some light on the event. And he basically talks about how there is, in the presentation, the PowerPoint, if you will, there was a slide of an alien, like a cartoon alien in a spaceship, and he kind of moved his way across the slide, and everybody had a good chuckle. And then the captain said something along the lines of well, we've all had some fun here, but now we're going to get down to business. And then they just continued on the meeting.
Yeah, so they were mocked or intimidated into silence, but they weren't actually told not to talk about the encounter.
Cahill does mention that. He says that was one of the things that to him took away credibility from his own actual experience, was the fact that nobody told him yo, you shouldn't talk about this.
Yeah, it kind of made him question himself.
Yeah. They kind of go into, in the episode, start to talk about how the military can at times use things like ridicule as a tactic to keep people quiet, because you want to keep your job and your good standing amongst your peers. So if they ridicule you a bit, then you'll know that's a place you really shouldn't tread. And so then hopefully you won't talk about it.
Yeah.
After their discussion, Sean and Lou go on a trip to Mexico, basically to the point where Kevin Day shows them that the UFOs that he saw would start to disappear off his radar. The initial spot they had went was Catalina Island, but this one's a little different. This one is actually the island of Guadalupe.
Yes, Guadalupe Island.
Lou basically says that when you interview people who are not trained observers, it's basically about the volume of people that you interview. And then after that, the commonalities that you then can put together from each person and what they said to you. Lou and Sean go to this island, the island of Guadalupe, which they're not actually allowed to step foot on because they're foreigners. That was their wording.
Seems like an oversight by the production department.
And you and I were talking about this because it's like, if you know you can't do this, and clearly they essentially take all this time to take a boat out there, they get out there, and then they have these boats of fishermen that randomly come up to them and then start professing their stories of UFOs that they've seen. To me, that kind of really took me out of the episode. It really it just broke the flow for me of what, because like when you go into this stuff, you really it doesn't put you on the edge of the seat, but it keeps you interested. It keeps you wanting to know what the next thing is that happened. I just kept waiting for this segment to get over.
Yeah, that's fair. And they really did just take a bunch of eyewitness testimony that you have no idea the credibility of it or anything. Various fishermen talked of sightings of spherical craft. Lou Elizondo got super excited when they were talking about the one that could dive underwater.
Yeah, so they use the going through and talking to all these different fishermen and interviewing them because they fish around the island. So it's the Unidentified's way of basically showing you that there are people that have this in their lexicon as commonalities, but yet, so, and then they don't think it's odd. Like they specifically mentioned, oh, hey, when a fisherman brings this up and says he saw something weird, do you guys make fun of him? And they were like, oh, no, like everybody takes it really seriously. So they were trying to show that in a different environment that this is maybe already being taken seriously, whereas there's not so much stigma and things like that are surrounding it. I just felt like they could have done this so much better than just interviewing boatloads of fishermen that literally they gave you 2 sentences of each guy's story, which broke down to, I saw a spherical craft that either came out of the sky or came up out of the water and then went whoosh and disappeared.
I guess they're trying to hammer home the point that it's a hot spot. It's a very common thing for these fishermen to see them. And they all have their different stories. But again, not credible people, not trained observers, as Lou Elizondo would say.
Yep, and that's why to them it meant a lot to have volume and then to then draw commonalities from that volume, which I can understand. I mean, if you had a lot of people that all experienced the same event, then if you were to interview all those people, if one person said that they saw something that nobody else saw, then you would certainly not be as likely to believe it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like a good thing to do to whittle down the general premise or idea.
So on the way there, they had met up with a journalist from Mexico who introduces them to a pilot who they said have seen some crazy things. He had 18 years of experience as a commercial pilot spotting bluefin tuna. The pilot says back in January of 2015 at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and about 23 miles southwest of Ensenada, Mexico. This is about 20 miles or so from the area where the Nimitz event occurred, about 11 years prior. So the pilot said that he saw an object with no wings, no windows, no flight surfaces. And when he had turned on the lights on his aircraft, that the object seemed to take notice of him and then flew past him at an incredible rate of speed.
Yeah, Senor Ojeda basically described a tic-tac craft that the Navy pilots have described seeing as well.
So this is a guy that's not associated with the military, but does fly in the same general vicinity as the Nimitz event occurred. And this is 11 years after the fact, and he's seeing similar objects.
Right.
The island of Guadalupe also has the Mexican Navy weather station and a marine refuge area And it's the actual best place on Earth, they said, to see great white sharks in the world. So they conclude the interviews by speaking with a marine biologist who lives on the island to study the great white sharks that we just mentioned, and he's been there for over 15 years. They also documented the largest great white shark ever on film. And he's basically said that the island is unique because the visibility of the water can be over 100 feet at times, and at certain points they can see over 30 sharks in just a single day. So they talk about how there's an electromagnetic anomaly that's off the north shore of the island of Guadalupe, and that they're not quite positive, but they believe that the sharks might be essentially using this electromagnetic anomaly to find the island due to the fact that it's so far out in the middle of nowhere and there's not really anything that surrounds it at all. The island was actually created kind of like Hawaii from volcanic eruptions. So it's not like there's land masses that are really near it or anything of that nature. So they often kind of wonder if that the electromagnetic anomaly is also what might be either bringing the UFO to the area, or whether that might be the cause of the UFOs or what.
Yeah, because there's a lot of sightings and quote unquote hotspots between Ensenada, California and Guadalupe Island, and above the northern coast of Guadalupe Island is where a lot of these supposed sightings occur and where that magnetic anomaly is.
So they asked the marine biologist if they have bioluminescence in the water in the area, and maybe if that could be some of what the fishermen are seeing with these kind of lights in the water and things of that nature. And they had basically talked about how, although they do give you lights in water with bioluminescence, they don't emerge from the water in spheres. So they don't really think that would be a likely candidate for what the fishermen are seeing. They also asked him about, I guess he has a submersible craft, and asked him if maybe that was what fishermen were seeing, but he mentioned there has to be a really big boat near it when they operate it. So he didn't think that would be likely the case either.
Mm-hmm. And so he explained away a couple of those things scientifically, or didn't explain away.
So they basically asked him towards the end if he had maybe his own experience or any explanations as to what they were seeing. And he said he didn't have any explanation as to what the fishermen were seeing, but he did have his own event that he had where he mentioned back in 2006, he saw a white object in the sky over the island that he thought might have been a star, but that it had started to move at high rates of speed over the island. He actually said he thought he was hallucinating because he hadn't had much sleep, but his captain of the ship had asked him if he had actually saw the object as well. So he knew he wasn't the only person that saw it. Mentioned basically that back in 2009, the ATIP program that we had mentioned that Lou Elizondo was kind of the head of, which was the government's investigation into UFOs, that back in 2009, the program had recognized the area off of the coast of California and these events to basically all be a coordinated hotspot of activity that's off of the coast of California. Mm-hmm. And they showed that map that they showed back in the second episode that Chris Mellon got, where it basically showed like a presentation of all the UFO hotspots that they had recorded all the way across the world. And one of those spots was the coast off of California. Right.
It was the first time they mentioned USOs was in this episode, and a USO is a unidentified submersible object, and they give a little nod back to Exercise Main Brace, which was a NATO exercise. It was a deployment of NATO anti-submarine warfare forces and aircraft carrier forces and supply convoys. Barely one day in, at least 2 reports were filed with authorities by naval personnel on ships in the Atlantic between Ireland and Iceland. First encounter involved a blue-green triangle traveling at about 1,500 miles per hour and giving off a white light exhaust. Numerous craft were reported during that NATO exercise, and this was back in 1952. They saw a lot of craft above and even below the water.
And that was one of the first more widely reported cases of USOs.
Yes.
So on the trip home from the island of Guadalupe, Cahill and Lou were talking, and they basically kind of discuss how they can understand why people don't come forward more, because the feeling of coming forward can be very isolating. And there were over 5,000 people that were on the ship that day. And they just don't understand why so few people are coming forward to talk about it, but also understand that isolation could certainly prevent a lot of those folks possibly from wanting to come forward. Cahill says that he doesn't know what he saw, but he knows that he saw something, and that what he saw was caught on tape and radar. So he doesn't necessarily know what it was, but he knows it was real.
Yeah, and you can tell he genuinely doesn't want to discount that experience and has a real hard time putting it behind him.
Yeah, they kind of make an effort to let you know that this is kind of the first time that he's come forward and discussed the events that happened on that day. So to wrap up their discussion between Lou and Sean, they were basically saying that, when you work for the military and you kind of give up so much for your country, to then have your country come back and tell you that you're crazy can be really disheartening. And that's kind of what pushed Lou to the brink of leaving, was because he felt that although he loved his job, if he left the job that he loved, it would make enough of a point to make people take him seriously.
Right.
And the show starts to make a point that while Lou was working at ATIP, there was a faction of the government that was working to kind of frustrate the program. And this made it a daily struggle to get anyone inside the Pentagon to take him seriously. They interview an intelligence officer who wants to remain anonymous, which they do a pretty bad job of helping to remain anonymous. It showed literally their entire body but their face. Like, if you knew this person, maybe even tangentially, you could probably pick them out from literally seeing their entire body but their face.
In their backyard.
Well, you don't know where they were at, but yeah, I get your point. Like, they just didn't do a very good job. And there's another point, another episode we'll get to later, where they kind of do a similar thing. And you're just like, what? If you're trying to keep them anonymous, why are you doing it this way? Like, there's just, I don't know, frustrating.
In that exchange, too, I believe Lou Elizondo mentions that he signed a non-disclosure agreement with the U.S. government. Is that the first that he's brought that up?
I would have to say I wouldn't think so, that it was probably mentioned earlier, but they do start to hammer that home more intentionally at this point, for sure.
Yeah, and he keeps bringing up that he knows things, but he can't talk about it. Yeah.
So the intelligence officer who wishes to remain anonymous said that she worked with Lou during his time at ATIP, and that basically he had miles of red tape that he had to go through to basically do anything. And it didn't matter what administration was in power, the situation would get very messy very quickly. She would go on to say that she believes there's just a part of the government that just doesn't really know how to address this issue. So basically, unless you get very vocal and public about it, then that can get bad for your career, but they're also not going to take you seriously about it. And they kind of start to give a little bit of the motivations behind why they might not be interested in figuring out what these things are. So take this for what you will. But the show basically...
Get out your popcorn.
Yes, exactly. The show basically says that there are some factions of the government who were fundamentalist Christian in their beliefs, and that just by looking into issues of UFOs, that you were basically inviting the devil into your life.
You're toying with a demonic presence, and you're going to bring about bad things.
Yeah, they said it was akin to voodoo. That basically, if you looked into this, it was going to basically take you further down that demonic road.
You don't want to go down that road.
Don't go down that road.
Well, I guess what I'm curious about is, if that is your belief, how do you plan on defending against that?
Apparently sticking your head in the sand.
La 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 la.
I mean, they're saying that they just don't want them to figure out what, like, don't look into it more, because then it's going to give it more power. So apparently if you ignore it, it's going to go away. Like, I don't
poke the bear.
Yeah. What, I mean, that's kind of one of the points that they make in the show, is saying that, okay, let's say that's what this is. shouldn't we still be preparing ourselves to combat this in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, it's akin to just burying your head in the sand. I don't care what you believe it is. You should probably be looking into it.
Yep. So they showed George Knapp, and he comes on to say that there's a faction in the government that are fundamentalist Christians, and that they believe that the study into the UFOs or anything of that type are inviting demonic powers into your life. And that this upset Lou so much that this kind of what led him down the path of quitting.
Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Yep. And he was even mentions being pulled into an office and being told basically that he needs to ignore these unidentified flying objects, just basically based off of the person's religious beliefs because it made him uncomfortable.
And here, sign this, never talk about it again.
Basically. So Lou said that in 2017, he realized that none of the ATIP briefings that they were doing were actually getting to the Secretary of Defense. He attempted meetings with the then Secretary of Defense, Mattis, and was turned down. This even after serving with the Secretary of Defense in Afghanistan. They said that after, even despite their best efforts with the help of Chris Mellon, they were still not able to get the issue in front of the Secretary of Defense. So that'll wrap up basically the third episode. We kind of been going through and doing a few questions at the end of each episode just to briefly discuss some thoughts and opinions about it. So we're going to go through that right now and then jump right back into the fourth episode. So we'll do this real rapid fire, okay?
Sounds good to me.
Did you enjoy the third episode?
It hit a little bit of a lull. Sean Cahill was somebody that was easy to believe, and his story lends a little bit of credibility. But there were other issues with the episode that made it a little harder to enjoy.
I, again, just have a problem with the order in which things are conveyed. Kind of bother me. They jump around so much. Even just trying to take notes to convey a congruent thought to people, like a sequential order of events, is hard. I had to keep going back in my notes and kind of adding things in so it would be a single thought, rather than just a random thing that comes in at the end.
Mm-hmm. And it makes you question whether that's on purpose or if it's just a glimpse into a sporadic mind of someone like a Mr. Tom DeLonge.
Yeah.
Or a Lou Elizondo.
Like if they told you the events in sequential order, it wouldn't make it more believable.
No, and it might even make it harder to make it believable.
There we go, leading us right into question 2. So episode 3, do you feel like it made the events more or less credible from the fishermen and all that fun stuff?
I'm still quite fascinated by the footage, and I was a little confused. They keep showing these 3 videos. Only one of them pertains to the USS Nimitz, but they're all really fascinating, and they are legitimate DoD declassified footage. So that in itself is pretty fascinating. But the fact that they present all 3 of them to you and throw the information around in random order makes it really hard to follow and get behind.
Hearing the stories of several fishermen did not, to me, lend more credibility to the story. Although, yes, you're trying to illustrate that there are hotspots of events, and maybe these people have seen these hotspots of events occur, and we can see that this is more of a reality to those folks. The way that they went about it, to me, wasn't in a way that made me feel like it was more credible.
Yeah, and it was very unprofessional. They took this trip out to Guadalupe Island. I guess we're to believe without looking into whether or not that they could actually visit this place. So they sat offshore and interviewed people who were willing to come to them. And it just got really hokey at that point, because I would think people of this caliber, experts, quote unquote, if you will, I would think they would look into where they could go, who they could talk to, and those things, and not take us down a 30-minute journey that was probably much more expensive and much longer for them to go to this place that they couldn't even step foot on.
Definitely. And that'll wrap up our review of the Unidentified episode 3 on the History Channel. Unfortunately, I would say this has probably been my least favorite episode thus far, but I can be happy to report that they followed it up with probably one of the best episodes that they've had yet. We'll be getting into that in just a second, but just remember, Beyond Explanation Episode 3, you can also find us at Escape the Mind Productions on YouTube, SoundCloud, Twitter, and iTunes. And just make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and hit the little bell just to make sure you get notified from when we post new content.
I didn't hear no bell.
And you can always write us at escapethemindproductions@gmail.com.